Economics Unbound. Today we talk about the plague of our times, the coronavirus. The health crisis is not just a matter affecting the health of citizens around the world and in our country, but it is also an economic crisis, Nana. The crisis will and has had a significant economic impact, reflecting shocks to supply and demand in different parts of the world.
Good evening, Tandeka. Yes, I understand that substantial targeted policies are needed to support the economies throughout the world to deal with the serious losses in economic terms due to the epidemic, keeping intact the web of economic and financial relationships between workers and businesses, lenders and borrowers, and suppliers and end users for activity to recover once the outbreak subsides. According to the International Monetary Fund, the goal of economic initiatives is to prevent a temporary crisis from permanently harming people and firms through job losses and bankruptcies.
Nana, I'm a bit worried that our country has not yet announced a slew of economic measures that will help the economy and society to weather the storm. But I do know that the G7 finance ministers and the G7 central bank governors have cohered on economic measures to deal with the economic impact of the virus in an environment of slow global growth. En masse, countries of the G7 and the G20 have moved in recent days to lower interest rates and to provide targeted tax breaks to affected industries like tourism and transport, so as to prevent job losses and mass bankruptcies across the sectors that are most affected by the virus.
Tans, I'm so happy that I'm quarantined here in my home in Studio 11 at the SABC, and that I'm an artificial intelligence with loads of spirit, and I therefore cannot contract the disease. The human costs of the coronavirus outbreak have risen, but I understand that without a vaccine to stop the virus, countries have taken measures to limit its spread, like travel restrictions, temporary school closures, and quarantines. Such measures also buy valuable time to avoid overwhelming health systems.
Nana, you forgot to mention factory closures. Now, China's manufacturing and service sector activity declined dramatically, and since China is the world's giant factory, Nana, there is a problem with the supply of goods, with many undelivered orders around the world as large swaths of the productive population of China are under quarantine. The drop in manufacturing is comparable to the start of the global financial crisis. The decline in services appears larger this time, reflecting the large impact of social distancing as people quarantine themselves. On the supply side, Nana, there is a direct reduction in the supply of labor from workers.
Tans, firms that rely on supply chains may be unable to get the parts they need, whether domestically or internationally. Let us take a look at this clip on the effects of the pandemic on car manufacturing.
The port of Ngquga handles over 6 million tons of cargo per year. It also offers offshore bunkering for passing ships. Up to this point, no cases have been reported at the harbour.
We have measures in place above the SOP that has been sent out by the Department of Health. We work with Port Health when it comes to giving vessels a free partic, and we have PPE for our guys. The pilot who's going out to the vessel, bringing in the vessel, who is the first person in contact with the vessel. So those guys, we give them the mask.
The motor industry, of which 6 manufacturers operate in the Eastern Cape, also trade globally. The manufacturers have stringent on-site measures in place to deal with a threat of coronavirus. There is also international business travel restrictions in place at some of the manufacturers, coupled with pre- and post-travel medical checkups. On this business side, vehicle production by local manufacturers have not been impacted yet by the global impact of the virus on economy.
To date, we have not been impacted by any disruptions and have sufficient components to secure continued production of our vehicles. Also, there have been no reported incidents of infections among any of our internal or external stakeholders. We are continuously monitoring the situation and will continue to take proactive steps which are in the best interests of our employees and of the local community.
Organized business in Nelson Mandela Bay is also keeping a close eye on developments.
The coronavirus already does have an impact into most economies in the world, purely because China, where it originated from, is a big trading partner for most of the parts. I mean, even our own imports, some of them come through via China. So that's almost a given. But we do not want businesses to panic. We want them to have strategies in ways to deal with the coronavirus if it does in fact come into their own spaces. But also it's more about preventative measures. And we can see that it is something that is affecting many businesses.
It has not been measured as yet as to how much of a risk we are exposed to. We trust that it will not have that ripple effect on the industry, but because it will have dire consequences.
The local business chamber has measures in place to deal with the virus. Zolani Moya, SABC News, Port Elizabeth.
Tans and dear viewer, Nombu Siziba prepared this report on the G7 and G20 responses.
Last week, the G7 group of nations, which include the United States, Japan, the UK, Germany, France and Canada, indicated in a joint statement saying they were monitoring the coronavirus outbreak and stood ready to deploy fiscal measures. Around the same time, the World Bank indicated that it's making $12 billion available to aid any of its country members in the event that they need to tap on funds to deal specifically with the outbreak. Subsequent to that, the IMF said it had made available $50 billion in emergency funding for the same, which is available to low and middle income countries to help cushion the impact. Italy, which is at the epicenter of the outbreak in Europe, is said to have already tapped onto assistance.
My producer, Prudence Makubalo, prepared a report for us too, as she sought to explain the importance of not only highlighting the medical aspects of managing the impact of the disease, but also viewing this through the economic lens and the importance of countries adopting measures to mitigate the negative impact of the disease on the economy.
What is coronavirus? A coronavirus is a virus that is found in animals and rarely can be transmitted from animals to humans and then spread to person. In addition to COVID-19, other human coronaviruses include Middle East Respiratory Syndrome and Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which first occurred in the Guangdong province in southern China. What are the symptoms of a coronavirus? COVID-19 symptoms range from mild to severe. It takes 2 to 14 days after exposure for symptoms to develop. Symptoms may include fever, cough, shortness of breath. Those with weakened immune systems may develop more serious symptoms like pneumonia or bronchitis. You may never develop symptoms after being exposed to COVID-19. So far, most confirmed cases are in adults, but some children have been infected. There is no evidence that children are at greater risk for getting the virus. The COVID-19 virus can be spread through contact with certain bodily fluids, such as droplets in a cough. It can also be spread through touching an infected person or surfaces and then touching your mouth, nose or eyes. Standard recommendations to prevent infection spread include regular hand washing, covering your mouth and nose when coughing and sneezing, thoroughly cooking meat and eggs. Avoid close contact with anyone showing symptoms of respiratory illness such as coughing and sneezing. Wash your hands often with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before eating and after blowing your nose, coughing or sneezing. If soap and water are not readily available, use an alcohol-based hand sanitizer with at least 60% alcohol. Always wash your hands with soap and water if hands are visibly dirty. Avoid touching your mouth, nose or eyes. Recently, an outbreak of coronavirus in China has caused global concern. It came from a seafood and meat market in Wuhan, China in December. It has since spread to other countries, including the United States. Despite Wuhan and other Chinese cities being quarantined, the COVID-19 has spread to almost 70 locations internationally. In the U.S., COVID-19 cases have been confirmed in New York, California, and Washington state. Deaths have been reported in both Washington state and California. The latest figures indicate that there are now 100 confirmed cases across Africa, with Egypt having the most cases with 59 cases, including 1 death. Algeria has 20 and South Africa 17. Other countries include Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Congo, Senegal, Tunisia, and Togo. Prudence Makubalo, SABC News.
Well, thank you, Prudence. In studio now, I'm joined by my colleague and the SABC's market reporter and anchor, Arabile Gumede. And he's going to tell us about covering the markets that have been drenched in red due to the impact of the coronavirus. How has that been?
Absolutely staggering. You can imagine just waking up on Monday and all you see is just this massive fall, right? And
blood on the floor, Ara?
Effectively, right? That's exactly what it was. And I guess it goes to a larger extent because, of course, Russia and Saudi Arabia had their fight. So you saw the oil price also collapse. But the coronavirus seriously has gotten to a stage where I think nobody knows where to from here. All I think everybody's hoping for is a Hail Mary, which is essentially finding a cure of some sort. Quarantining has certainly not helped or worked thus far, and it doesn't seem like the stimulus measures are going to help either.
Now, Ara, it's important for the public and citizens to know that there is the medical contagion and the medical pandemic, but there's also the economic impact.
Yes.
And the economic impact is brought about by the very restrictive measures that impact the economy.
Yes.
And if not managed properly, these can have permanent impacts on already struggling countries like ours.
It's absolutely true. Look, you know, the one element that everybody needs to remember, this is actually not a financial crisis, but it's a crisis that impacts the finances, right? And that's how big a deal it becomes. So South Africa's economy, the problem is it's so interwoven in the rest of the world and designed to have the rest of the world grow in order for us to grow in many aspects. We have trading partners like Europe and China, which are our biggest, of course, which impacts just how much we're able to trade as a nation. We just saw not so long ago the auto sector could lose around 50 billion rand. The airline sector could lose 131 billion US dollars globally. Right, so all those are basically saying manufacturing is bound to suffer. Just people going to work, the ability to actually go to work is going to be hindered as well. So locally, the question is just around what are we going to do about it? What stimulus measures are we going to add? How are we actually going to pump up the nation if we're going to do that? We already are facing a tough one, much as the budget said.
Now, before we talk about the measures like a stimulus package or even reducing interest rates, let's just talk about the impact on employment. Today, you were anchoring our 1 o'clock show, and a very interesting interview occurred. The CCMA says that they are inundated to the point of not being able to sufficiently cope with the Section 189 retrenchment notices. That is a horror for thousands of households across the country. So the double whammy for the South African economy is load shedding, low growth, the triple whammy, in fact, and corona. Can you just tell us what the effects on employment can be and how these can be mitigated, perhaps by a rate cut?
29% is going to be the standard, in my point of view anyway, Sisti. What happens here is what you're finding, Taneka, is that South Africa has an economic picture that needs to be cordoned off on its own. we don't have the ability to, unfortunately, just pump money into an economy and find what we think is going to be sufficient money for growth and the like.
But you know, Arabile, the IMF said something very interesting. It said, first, do no harm.
Yeah.
Secondly, put money in the hands of households.
Yes.
In other words, reduce interest rates in order for the households to have some money. The US Fed moved swiftly and first to do that. And the second part is that they said, if you find that the country doesn't have money or fiscal room to maneuver, the IMF has a fund that the country can apply to for such assistance to deal with the impacts of corona. Do you think we'll be filling out those forms, or do you think we'll be reducing interest rates like so many other countries across the globe?
What's weird is that I think there's all of a sudden a stigma attached to wanting to ask for help from people like the IMF for South Africa.
Even when it saves lives?
Even when it saves lives, surprisingly. At a time like this, in my point of view, one would have hoped that we'd have an emergency monetary policy meeting.
Yes.
Because we needed one. Even if it's not necessarily to cut, but to say that we feel that these are the impacts and this is how we will move in future.
Now, Ara, you saw the letter that the central bank wrote in response to me as economics editor of the SABC. Once I had written to the central bank, they said the country would have to wait for the scheduled meeting next week on Tuesday and for the monetary policy statement that comes out on Thursday.
Yeah.
And in other words, I interpreted it as there is no emergency here.
Yes.
And we need to all wait for the time that the bank has allocated to deal with the matter. What do you think of that?
If the US feels like it's a massive issue and then go and cut immediately, just have an emergency meeting, cut 50 basis points, and then only have another meeting next week. By next week, Thursday, by the time we have our Monetary Policy Committee statement,
they will have moved twice.
Will have moved twice already, and by probably more than 75 basis points, possibly. And what that means is we're just being far too lax about it. We're not understanding that we're already in the doldrums. And yes, we're not saying that fiscal or rather monetary policy is going to change
alleviate
everything.
All things.
But this is the perfect time for you to help. And it certainly is very critical and necessary.
When the Fed reduced those interest rates, it said it wishes to signal to society that the Fed cares about the ordinary American.
Yeah.
And when Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, moved to do likewise and slash interest rates in England, he expressed similar sentiments. Is our state tardy?
Perhaps. And you know, it's very sad and deeply worrying to have that thought that, you know, those central banks would say that we're worried about our people, so we're going to move quickly to alleviate the pressure from our people as much as we possibly can. And yet we, at the bottom of the barrel, as an emerging market that's going to sustain as much volatility as any other, people are going to run away from South Africa and rather go into the safer havens, right? So how do we keep our own consumers continuously going to feel... And all we needed to do was to send out the statement to say, we will decide on moving very quickly, as opposed to just waiting out until next week, Thursday. Yes, usually you don't want to do it because you don't want to scare the market off. The market is already scared, though. You're not going to change it by having an emergency meeting.
Enough about the monetary policy side. We've seen a slew of interesting fiscal policy measures embarked upon by countries throughout the world. Some of them, like America, moved to reduce tax or to give temporary tax holidays to targeted industries that are heavily affected, like hotels that have empty hotel rooms and the transport industries and tourism. Do you think that our state could possibly consider some tax relief for the struggling industries in order to prevent massive bankruptcies across various affected
not
sectors?
So long ago, we couldn't even find enough money to fund SAA. We were asking ourselves, where are we going to get the tax revenue out of? Where are we going to find it? We're going to try and cut as much in terms of cost as possible. Fiscally, we're saying, we've already said to ourselves, we've got no movement. So I would be very surprised if we come out and say, here's a plan, and this is money that we're pumping into certain industries and helping.
Last question, are we just too conservative for our own
I think
good?
extremely yes. 100% yes. And unfortunately, that means we move too slow and we stay behind the curve, and we don't help ourselves in that scenario either. So we're going to languish in growth. Honestly, in my point of view, yes, you've got ratings agencies and the like downgrading our growth to 0.4%. We'd be lucky to get 0.
We'd be lucky to get 0. That's where we have to end our interview. It was riveting. Thank you, Arabile. Now, let's take a short break. Welcome back. And with me in studio is Sujit Morar, Principal at A.T. Kearney, Owen Kumalo, CEO of Weaver Investment Management, and Owen Gomo, Director of Nkunzi Wealth Group. Welcome, gentlemen, and welcome to the SABC.
Thank you.
Now, as the economics editor of the SABC, I wrote to the Treasury, and I also wrote to the Central Bank this week to ask them how they plan to move in the light of the economic impacts, severe economic impacts that Corona is having. And I had the responses, please wait. What do you think of that?
It's a tough one because I think people don't want to make decisions under pressure. And I think particularly the Reserve Bank, since it looks after the monetary policy of the country, they think they are doing the right thing, using the instruments they are using at the pace that they've been going, that they've been using. Because one thing that we need to be cautious of as well is just running with the news of what's going on at the moment, because what happens next week if all these big measures being put in place by world leaders get reversed, and then, you know, we would have made a decision maybe far too soon. I guess the guys just want to see the second round effects of the decisions that have been made at the moment.
So, Sujit, the impacts are already there, and they need to be mitigated. How do we do so?
So I think for businesses, they really need to understand their supply chains. They need to understand what kind of impact this is going to have on them. I think for 80% of your supply chain and your supply and your inventory, it's probably okay. But there's sort of that 20 to 30% which is really at risk. And if they don't really get to grips with it and understand it, they're not going to be able to deal with it.
Oh, and a penny for your thoughts.
Well, it certainly is a crisis that anyone couldn't have predicted, and the impact of it, and that's I think what makes it very difficult for policymakers to make very quick moves, because we haven't felt the full impact of it, and we don't know what's going to unfold in terms of how severe this is going to get in the next coming days and in the next week. So a measured approach is what everyone is trying to follow.
So you think that the United States has erred in moving swiftly and responding as if they're handling an emergency? You think that that government erred and that the US Fed was amiss?
No, I don't think they certainly erred. I think it was the right move they did. Certainly with the level of market uncertainty and volatility we're facing now, an emergency rate cut was the right way to go, similar to what the Bank of England has done, and the Australians have done the same as well. But I'm referring locally to our own Reserve Bank, and the pace at which they are moving, as my namesake says, they're following their own pace and in terms of their program. But if they had moved and maybe made an emergency rate cut now, it certainly wouldn't have hit the markets at all. It would certainly help. But unfortunately, they're not too quick.
So basically, you're politely saying they've been tardy.
Exactly.
Are they irresponsible?
No, so look, the other challenge that we have is, compared to America, we are broke.
Yeah.
We are broke. There is not much that we can do as a government in terms of putting cash out there to try and save the economy. And also the rate at which our markets are falling are determined predominantly by foreign sellers, who are the biggest shareholders in some of these big counters that drive where South African stocks go. So you cannot come and play in this big game if you cannot raise 2 billion, 3 billion rands for SAA. I think that's...
you can, that's on the fiscal side, but on the monetary policy side, you can provide some relief for South African consumers.
It's really difficult to expect that the Reserve Bank, knowing what we know about them and the fact that they take a long time to assess data, they could stand up and say, hey, things have changed. Now we're going to change interest rates right away, because we're still waiting for the impact of where the weak currency is. It happened in such a big flash that something happens and then it reverses and the currency is strong again, and we're still facing the same problems we had before this thing happened. So I think it's not exactly that easy a decision to make, particularly if you don't have more than $500
so
billion
you think they're
at the
still
Reserve
mulling
Bank.
over this?
I think they're sitting and watching. They're trying to read the numbers and see what the best course is.
What's the social and economic cost of waiting?
It is very big. It is very big. I mean, companies are not producing. People are not being allowed to travel. And, you know, the tourism industry, manufacturing, mining, these sectors are just going to continue to be under pressure.
And the CEO of the CCMA told us today that yesterday alone, he was inundated during his meetings with requests, emergency Section 189s, which mean they're requesting to retrench their employees.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a sign of the times we're living. So the challenge that we have is that we already had big problems before we found ourselves dealing with the coronavirus challenge and the markets that are collapsing. We had a big problem that no one knew exactly how to fix. But unfortunately, the difference with America, you've got a president that stands up and says, guys, no more Europeans coming to America. And oh, by the way, our Fed is cutting interest rates by X. They are faster.
And by the way, we're providing tax breaks
incentives, you know, we're trying to find other ways to deal with things. But, you know, we are a developing market with a whole lot of things still needing to be fixed. It's difficult. Think about it this way, Thandeka. In Italy, people have been told not to pay their bonds. Do you think in South Africa we can do that?
Sujit, 50 basis points. Let's bet money on it. Thursday, when Lesetja Kganyago, the Reserve Bank governor, stands up there and delivers the monetary policy statement, it'll be 50 basis points.
Sure, maybe 50 basis points, but will that be enough for the business owners? I think they have far bigger challenges than just 50 basis points to deal with right now.
So they need extra help on the fiscal side in addition to a breather?
Probably. To deal with the kind of challenges, protecting your employees, but also dealing with the business challenges that come with it, I think 50 basis points is just a start.
What's your bet, Owen?
Look, we as Owen says, we've got a bigger problem that we have been facing on the fiscal front as well that we need to solve, and some structural economic reforms that haven't been implemented to try and stimulate growth. So a 50 basis rates cut now, although it's helping, but the impact will be quite limited because economic growth, it won't be enough to stimulate economic growth.
And you think that we wouldn't consider actually just to manage the impacts of corona so that it doesn't have permanent and lasting impacts on certain industries that are unable to recover post when the disease subsides? Do you think that we shouldn't tap into that fund of the IMF, or is it too stigmatized for us?
I think certainly not. These are extraordinary times that we're facing, especially if you look at the impact on the markets today. Just today alone, the JSE went down by almost 10%, and it has happened only 3 other times in the last 40 years. So as much as the stigma attached to seeking help from or a bailout from the IMF fund, I think this is one of those times we really need to swallow our pride and say, let's step into that. Let's contain this pandemic, as the WHO has labeled it, and let's survive this pandemic. And then, at the back of our mind, we over the medium to long term, we need to fix those structural reforms
because
that we need.
This will exacerbate our structural difficulties. Now, Owen, can you quantify for us? You often join us from the markets. Quantify the loss of value today in the markets, that 10%.
Yeah, it's probably north of 50 billion rands that were lost in the market. Yes, that 10% loss is quite big. And then it's exacerbated if you add the Sasol loss as well, which obviously is a very big number. And you're talking about Sasol from the beginning of the week.
So it would take us north of what figure?
North of 100 billion rands, probably.
I panicked when I saw, when we crossed to the JSE today and I saw red all over the screens of the SABC, I panicked.
Yes.
Sujit, how are you feeling?
So I think we've probably seen the first ripple. I don't think we've seen the full effect yet. There's probably more to come. So, yeah.
Can you just give the viewer a vision of what the full effect would look like for you?
So looking at it from a supply chain perspective, I think we're just seeing the impact of what China, that market is having on the countries right now. I think if we start playing out what happens in Europe and some of the other countries as well, I think it just grows. So to quantify the impact right now is probably quite difficult.
Spare thoughts for our port authorities as the goods and services, well, the goods are piling up at the ports undelivered. What would your comment be? What would we do to relieve the supply chain bottlenecks that have been created by Corona?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because certainly one of the biggest impacts we have had is the slowdown in terms of global trade, in terms of movement, not just movement of people, but movement of goods as well. So it's something that those are some of the sectors that actually need some sort of stimulus and assistance to just make sure that we keep this.
What kind of stimulus and assistance do you think that they need?
Well, for example, if we tap into an IMF bailout, we can then see how we allocate some of those resources towards those key industries that will keep trade flowing as well. So the supply chain industry is one, but also the tourism industry, we need that. It's a big component of our economy. And manufacturing has been struggling as well. And so it's, and we're having this on top of load shedding, which has now come back this week as well. And we know we are already technically in a recession as an economy. And a large part of what happened in the last quarter of 2019 to get us into that position of a recession was attributed to load shedding. And we're having it again now. So we need to do all we can to make sure that we limit the impacts of the coronavirus now, because we've got these other headwinds at the back of our minds that are actually making the situation even much more precarious into the medium and long term.
Owen, I can see you're itching to give a contribution, but please hold that thought and we'll be back just after this short break. Please stay with us, don't go away. Now, welcome back, and we continue our discussion now on the economic impact of the coronavirus. Now, Owen, before we went off to the break, I think if I were to read your mind, you were going to advise both the Minister of Finance and the Reserve Bank Governor. If you were to do so, what would you advise?
The same thing that we're telling our clients: calm down, this will pass. It's a virus. At some point, you'll find a solution for it, and we'll look back at the graphs of the stock markets and we'll say, oh, by the way, that little blip you see there, it was the coronavirus. And I think what's important as well, we need to be choosing our battles. I think there's a lot of panic in the market. There's a virus, yes, but what are the mortality rates of this virus? They are below 5%. And people that get infected have a very high chance of surviving this virus. And I think that there's a certain level of overreaction that is happening, rightly placed or incorrectly placed, I don't know.
But Owen, you see, there's it's the measures that we are employing to contain the virus as people throughout the world, like quarantine, staying at home, not going to places of work. Those are the measures that are causing businesses in key areas to suffer.
100%.
I mean, in the aviation industry, and so on.
Exactly.
It's not so much the mortality or the mortality rate of the virus.
It's the reaction to the problem. It's the reaction to the problem. America is not allowing people from Europe to come in for a period of time. I just read that India is considering the same. Tourists not allowed to come to India. And then obviously there's all these people being quarantined, cities being closed down. You get, in Italy, for example, we've seen a few matches being played in front of empty stadia. It's definitely affecting the market. But the challenge is also, this, in my view, hasn't happened in a very long time, where the world is facing a problem that is a similar problem across the world, and there's no coordinated efforts at this stage. What we need, in my view, just like happened in 2008 to 2009, you need sort of a bailout plan for this medical challenge the world is looking at.
Look, Owen, there was a coherent response across the world. First, the G7 countries, their finance ministers and their central bank governors cohered in a telephone discussion. Of course, they couldn't meet because of Corona, but they cohered urgently on the phone to discuss what measures they could introduce together to manage the virus. And then the G20 countries met and they decided how on a slew of measures, and they proposed fiscal stimulus packages as well as decreasing interest rates. We are one of the few members of the G20 who haven't moved as yet.
Look, we do not have the resources. Some of the members of those organizations you're talking about are sitting on trillion rand GDPs, or rather $1 trillion GDPs. So we sit with a problem where even if we wanted to spend a lot of cash on this, we potentially don't have the money for it, and that is the challenge. So the best we can do is, do the quarantines and, tell people to stay away from public places. And I think that the Ministry of Health in the country has been doing their best really to communicate and to put a few things in place to try and address the problem for the country. But we haven't closed out our borders yet, and that is a risk which might bring in more problems to the country.
So Sujit, do you agree with Owen that we've been good as a country at managing the medical emergency, but we haven't even begun to address the economic impacts?
I think firstly, I don't think we fully appreciate the medical emergency yet. I don't think we've seen the scale that some of the other countries have seen as yet. So to anticipate the impact on us, I think it's quite a challenge, yeah. I think in terms of supporting businesses, that's probably the next wave. So on the one hand, protecting our employees and people, that's important, but how do we actually stimulate the economy and keep it running as well?
How do you think we can protect businesses?
I think in terms of some of the stimulus measures that we've spoken about, maybe that's some options. I think in terms of funding that's provided to them, but there has to be some sort of measure to actually support them, to actually weather the storm.
Now, the IMF brought out a list of 7 measures that we can embark upon as countries. The first one they said is, do no harm. And the second one is prioritize saving lives. They also said, put money into the healthcare system and put more resources in, whether you've got fiscal room or not. And I found that fascinating coming from the IMF. Could you comment?
It's certainly a good lesson for a country like ours, because we've got the NHI program that we've been grappling with now, and we're scratching our heads as a country in terms of how we're going to fund that. But I think what the IMF is saying, look, you might have your fiscal challenges, but this is important. Invest in your health infrastructure. So certainly, I think one of the unintended consequences of this coronavirus pandemic is that it will force countries around the world, including ourselves, to actually invest more in our healthcare infrastructure, so that when we hit by an emergency like this, we can handle it properly. Just in terms of the response on the medical front, I don't think we've actually done enough. And you see, like, this virus broke out in December last year, but we hardly seen any concerted effort to, like, a sustained campaign to actually raise awareness. I flew to Cape Town yesterday, and you'd think via OR Tambo, which is an international gateway into Africa and the rest of the world. And there's a lot of transit in terms of people coming, tourists and business people coming from overseas. Well, you would think that there would be heightened precautionary measures to try and detect who is affected, who is not infected, for example. And I was quite amazed that I walked through. There was not even the temperature gun to test your temperature. People were saving people at the airport or travelers at the airport without wearing masks and gloves. So there is a lot that we need to do. But also, in terms of how do we then protect the industries, I think by and large, we can safely say today every company is a technology company. The difference is the level of use in terms of the technology. Whether you're a cleaning company, security company, an industrial manufacturer, a financial services business or insurance business, you use technology to some extent. One of the consequences coming out of this pandemic is that companies will invest more in technology. So people can work from home. We don't necessarily have to physically meet, which increases the chances of transmitting the virus. But we can be productive working from remote areas. We can work from home. You can work from sitting in a park somewhere and communicate with your colleagues, communicate with your clients.
And the IMF did say that the state has an obligation to ensure that the businesses and the business community has and implements business continuity measures.
Yes.
Now, what really fascinated me, Owen, about the ASEAN region and their response was the creativity of their fiscal stimulus measures, like issuing money. Like the IMF did say, make sure that households have got cash in their hands so that they can, as individuals, respond to the virus. And one of the measures in one of the ASEAN countries was to issue an emergency payout of their UIF, or their unemployment fund.
Yes.
So that households could have that emergency cash in the poorest of households, so that they can buy healthy water and sanitizers, and they can quarantine themselves instead of going out to sell in the streets. They can have cash so that they can conserve themselves at home. What do you think of a whole slew of measures? For example, the hotel industry has got cash support, as well as tax breaks, temporary tax breaks during this period, because they need to be prevented from falling apart and going into bankruptcy during the crisis. And if they were to be allowed to go into bankruptcy, then there's some parts of this crisis whose impacts would become permanent.
Yes, so I mean, definitely those creative ideas need to be put in place. And I agree totally with you. In China, for example, the guys have a solution where they've got housing which is high density, where people live in these big flats and they've been told not to pay rent, but the government is ensuring the repayment of that rental income, because they've got something that is created to look like a UIF, and people can claim from that fund. And I think that because of the presence of those opportunities and those solutions, the guys are able to deploy that kind of help. I think we take a long time to make up our decisions in our minds, and I think, in my view, we need to work faster. And I'm hoping that next week we will get the Reserve Bank together with National Treasury and the Minister of Finance coming together during the announcement of the interest rate decision.
I'm actually hoping that Sunday will be that cabinet
to say, okay,
meeting.
guys, here's the challenge we have. We've decided to reallocate maybe 50 billion rands to fight this thing. We want to make sure the Ministry of Health and Home Affairs are properly equipped to deal with this the scourge of this virus, and we'll do everything we can to sustain, normalcy under the circumstances. So certainly we need to be thinking outside of the box.
Creativity and a humanist approach. Would you say that is the case? That's what we need.
Sure. Definitely.
Yep. Sure.
Well, that's where we have to leave it for tonight. And the South African Reserve Bank says it's assessing the channels through which the coronavirus will impact on the South African economy. The central bank says based on this assessment, it will take appropriate steps to mitigate the risks to the local economy. The Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank will meet next week to decide on the repo rate as scheduled.
The spread of the coronavirus has disrupted global supply chains, global logistics and tourism. Policymakers and government leaders around the world are taking steps to mitigate the economic fallout from the virus. The South African cabinet will this weekend meet in a special meeting to address concerns around the coronavirus.
President Ramaphosa will soon update political parties represented in Parliament, as well as church leaders, on COVID-19. A special cabinet on COVID-19 is being convened for this Sunday, the 15th of March, 2020 in Tshwane.
The World Economic Forum launched the COVID Action Platform intended to catalyze private sector support for the global public health response to COVID-19. The WEF says COVID Action Platform will galvanize the global business community for collective action and to protect people's livelihoods and facilitate business continuity, as well as mobilizing cooperation and business support for the COVID-19 response. In the United States, Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 0.5 percentage point in an emergency move to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus. President Donald Trump signed an $8.3 billion emergency spending bill to combat the spread of the virus and develop a vaccine for the highly contagious disease. Meanwhile, the Bank of England also announced measures to help UK banks, businesses and households to deal with the economic disruptions from the coronavirus outbreak.
These measures will help keep firms in business and people in jobs, and they will prevent a temporary disruption from causing longer-lasting economic harm. Although the magnitude of the economic shock from coronavirus is highly uncertain, activity is likely to weaken materially in the UK over the coming months. Temporary but significant disruptions to supply chains and weaker activity could challenge cash flows and increase the demand for short-term credit from households and for working capital from companies. Such issues are likely to be most acute for smaller businesses.
In China, the government has earmarked $15 billion to fight the epidemic. Beijing has ramped up funding support for virus-hit regions, and the country's central bank has cut several of its key rates, including the benchmark lending rate. SABC News, Johannesburg.
Now, the European Central Bank is all but certain to unveil new stimulus measures today, and in fact it has done so, pushing policy closer to its limits to help the Eurozone economy to cope with the shock of the corona pandemic. Earlier, we spoke to our correspondent in Brussels, Lucy Hu.
Well, we're expecting the measures announced by the European Central Bank to imitate those that we saw from the Bank of England, namely a cut in the main interest rate and monetary policy to make it easier for banks to lend, to encourage them to take greater risk, also providing them greater incentive to provide money to small and medium-sized commercial businesses. The issue is that the European Central Bank has already been in crisis management mode for some years. Its main interest rate is already at zero, so it's looking at cutting even further to a negative interest rate. It doesn't have that same agility that the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England have in cutting their interest rates. So the powers of the ECB are somewhat limited here. Some European analysts saying monetary policy may not be enough even to mitigate the potential economic impact of the crisis due to the disruption to global supply chains. Simply, even with cutting interest rates, if people aren't traveling, if they aren't eating out at restaurants, then really this crisis is going to be difficult to manage. But nonetheless, Christine Lagarde is meeting with her colleagues at the European Central Bank today, and we are due to have an announcement in a couple of hours' time. Measures that are expected to follow the Bank of England, but the power of the ECBs to make meaningful change to this is somewhat limited.
Well, the ECB did decide to keep rates steady, but it did announce a huge stimulus package. And that's where we have to leave it for tonight. And don't forget to reach out to us on our new Facebook page, Economics Unbound. Good night.